And welcome to the June 15th weekly JupyterLab call. Today we have 16 people on the call right now, and you should find the agenda linked in the chat. I guess I should say for people who come to this from the recordings, the meeting minutes are also in the JupyterLab Team Compass repo and a pinned issue. So if you ever are curious what these meeting minutes we refer to are, that's where the archive of them is. So with that said, let's get started. Today, first on the agenda is Jeremy.
Yeah, the first item is a new pre-release for JupyterLab 4.0. So if you want to give it a try, I will post a link to a gist on the notes. The other thing I wanted to bring was a pull request that iterates on the Gitbot configuration that was added a while ago. To be able to also work on the documentation. So sometimes people don't want to go through the whole setup locally just to work on the docs, make some edits, and then see the rendered documentation. So instead, they can use online environments such as Gitbot. So it's just iterating on the previous setup. So if someone is interested, it's ready for review. And another thing also is the Code 6 pull request by Johan. So there is a link to pull request, and now it's building and working on Binder. So if you want to give it a try, please feel free. So it's just to get a feeling of what it is to use the Code 6. I think there are still a couple of things to fix in the test, and maybe some CSS tweaks as well. But although apart from that, it seems to be working. So that's good news. And that's it.
Any questions, comments?
Just looking for the binder on that page.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so Isabella says she won't be here until the last half of the call. I just had a quick update on the conversation we had last week about getting and setting the service manager instance. And I came to a few conclusions based on the questions that came out of this call, and also just thinking about looking at how extensions use the service manager. The conclusion I've come to for now is that this get instance and set instance set of functions is probably fine and helpful for people, again, to not have to thread down their component tree, the service manager. However, the introduction of the new semantic of replacing the current instance is not safe, because service manager really is just a collection of individual entity managers for settings or for kernel specs, etc. And each of those has a slightly different API from the other because it's fit for purpose and they have signals on them. And so if you want to swap it, you have to handle that signaling. I do think that maybe what I can do is clean up this PR and make it just be about events, take this concept, put it in a separate PR where also the service manager class itself is refactored, so that what you replace are actually the individual mini service managers that you care to replace. But the service manager class is a true singleton that always exists, so that we can give runtime APIs for people to swap out where those services are hitting, but so that the signal management is proxied basically by a singleton that never goes away. That might be a thing we consider, maybe not. But the uncontroversial part to me seems like giving people a way to access that singleton and not introducing a way to break JupyterLab beyond how you could currently break it. So, yeah, that's I think what will be in this PR is the existence of those two functions. But if you try to set instance a second time, it'll throw an error and say, sorry, you can't do that. And so you're in a world where no semantics of extension authoring or use are any different, really. There's just this one helper thing called get instance that gives you the service manager if you are writing an extension. Yeah, because introducing the new idea comes with all that baggage and signal management, and we don't have an answer for that. So I don't think this would, strictly speaking, make it a better API. It seems like it would make it a more dangerous API.
Will we still be able to get the service manager from the app object passed into an extension?
Yes, it'll exist there. And if you did service manager.get instance equals app.service manager, it'll always be true. Yeah. So because of that, I don't believe this will be a controversial new API. I think it'll be fine. It doesn't allow you to do anything differently than now. It just gives you basically a helper function. But it does set us up for a world where maybe we can write service manager in a way that allows you to modify it at runtime without having to write your own application and instantiate your own service manager within that application. I don't know what the answer to that yet is, but yeah, that seems like another possible extension point in a future PR, not this one. So Robert, service manager, Singleton would work for me. I need to replace a default drive in my case. So when you say the Singleton would work for you, are you, even if you cannot modify, well, you can't modify the service manager to be a different one in this model, the same way you already cannot? Like, there's no new capability introduced here. So are you sure it solves your problem? It seems like you remain with the original problem you had.
Maybe not. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought we were trying to make it more configurable. But if that's the next step, then I can be patient for that.
I think it would be nice to make it more configurable, but it was as a first pass approach, what I hadn't considered was extensions that have already relied on signal connections.
Yeah.
And there's no mechanism now for them to reconnect to a different thing. And I think it would be too big an imposition to ask extension authors to worry about when a service manager has been disposed. I think that actually is the domain of the application to deal with and not extension authors. Yeah. So I think the answer here would be for service manager maybe to have a register and unregister API or something like that. So you could say, actually, your events implementation, I don't care about that. I want you to use this events implementation. But the service manager persists. And it proxies through the signals so that no one has to disconnect and connect to a different set of signals. They can write their extension logic in a way that just believes the service manager always exists. So yeah, I think that's going to have to be in a future date.
Totally agree. And I think it's a reasonable assumption, like I said before, for the service manager to be consistent throughout the life of the notebook, maybe just optional at the time of initialization or something like that. But in my case in particular, the service manager chooses some defaults, which I cannot unchoose, and default drive is an example in my case.
So I think basically the places where signals already exist, presumably they exist because they were APIs people needed. So we probably have to account for places where signals exist and allow them to remain no matter what gets swapped out at runtime. When an attribute needs to be modified, if it's an attribute people were relying on to never be modified, then merely adding a new signal might not be sufficient. So say default drive is meant to be like a read-only and there's no default drive change signal. Adding a default drive change signal might not be enough because your extension sort of looks like it's working, but it's now able to break in a way that wasn't before. So this probably requires some careful thought about how to make the APIs not work against extension logic that currently works with semantics that look nearly identical but have different consequences. So I think we just need to think this through a little bit, but it's like a reasonable thing to want to swap out your service manager. So the answer might be that actually you don't swap out your service manager with an extension like a classic Jupyter front-end plugin, but instead we put in a different extension point in the application lifecycle for this specific use case or something. I'm not sure, but because it wasn't obviously the way that my current PR was headed, I don't now feel confident about what the mechanism for doing this is. I think there's a lot of ways of coming at it. And because it's like a thing, a few things already have to do, it's worth thinking about how to do it. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question? You said
Yeah.
events was the non-controversial part. Can you just briefly explain what the events API endpoint is?
Sure. So there is a PR that was merged into Jupyter Server that exposes a WebSocket that publishes JSON blobs that contain descriptions of various events that have occurred in your environment. So they could be things like a new user has logged in, or a message, a comment was added to the notebook you're looking at. Or it could be something like an extension has published a mouse click event occurred in these coordinates because that extension cares about telemetry. Or it could be something like a thing that's pushed by the server, like the server says, I don't know, running out of RAM or something like that, and pushes that event up. And so the Jupyter server endpoints are a WebSocket that you subscribe to and a endpoint that you could do a post to push an event into this event bus that will then be published up the WebSocket. There's a new package called Jupyter Events that the server relies on that exposes an event bus that's just a generic thing that collects all events and allows you to subscribe to them as an extension on the backend. And that is the basis for building things like telemetry as an add-on extension. And it's also the basis for building things like notifications inside JupyterLab. And just like any other REST and WebSocket endpoints that the server ships with, we have a package in JupyterLab services. So the bit that I'm saying is uncontroversial is basically an event manager, just like we have a settings manager. Lane asks in the chat, will events cover user-facing things like errors or all cells completed? So events is a very generic system. It'll cover anything an extension decides to push into it. So if the extension that you're talking about, so for the notebook extension, for example, could execute a cell finished event if it wants, right? And then anything else can be listening and saying, oh, cool, I care about when cells execute because I want to compare them to like cells that some user right-clicked on and said, I care about this one or whatever, and I want to pop up an alert. Or maybe just all of them pop up alerts, who knows, that might be configurable. But yes, it is intended for that particular use case among others.
Is there a design doc or documentation for this event system and like the message format, things like that?
Yes, so there is a document in Jupyter Server, an issue that I will link both in the meeting minutes and here in the chat, called an event system for Jupyter. And I just linked in the chat as well. And so this describes some of what I just said, but it also describes like what a use case, a potential use case of this is, which is the JupyterLab notifications package that we would like to migrate eventually from the Jupyter Cal Poly org into JupyterLab and into core. So this is like how do you use these building blocks to build some extension like this in the UI, which I think is what Lane was getting at. And we've had a long series of conversations about this in Jupyter Server. And now that some of that has been hashed out and landed in Server, it's going up the stack to JupyterLab.
Is there a, so I see the issue, I see the discussion, etc. Is there a final like end user level documentation for it versus wading through a discussion and ideas here, ideas there that may or may not be implemented? Does that
So
make sense?
the idea was that this top level comment actually comes from a HackMD that's probably somewhere deep in that thread. The top level comment is meant to be the distillation of all that discussion. So hopefully you can refer to that as the thing, but this isn't like API docs. API docs are just going to ship with Server just like anything else. So the events that have been added do have those API docs. And of course, this PR that I'm offering on the JupyterLab services side will also have docs as well. But in terms of like another resource for a design document, this issue is it, and the top level comment is it.
Okay, so there's not a doc page in the Jupyter Server docs, for example, that talks about the event system.
I don't think yet because there's no release of Jupyter Server that has it yet, but there will be as soon as it's released, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm working off of a Jupyter Server self-install, like off a branch on my machine right now. Okay. Is Isabella here? If not, we can skip and go to David.
Doesn't look like she's here.
Cool. Go for
Yeah.
it.
All right. I have a pull request in. I'm just going to post it in the chat as well. But basically, I fixed these Markdown and Python logos. I'm not really sure if anybody else noticed, but they do look kind of weird by default. And the general idea is that I believe we should seriously consider rehauling the way that we handle CSS classes in JupyterLab. So specifically, a lot of the CSS classes that we are using, half of them are going unused. So for example, we have JP icon 0 through 4, we have JP icon accent, JP icon brand, and all of these are not actually being used in the manner that they're intended to. So for example, we see icons that are using JP icon accent basically just to color something purple, which works totally fine in the light and dark themes that ship by default. But when theme developers override these colors thinking that they're, you know, being used appropriately, they're actually not, and they break a lot of the colors. So for example, if a I believe right now, if a theme developer were to override what is it, JP icon brand, it actually, oh no, sorry, JP icon worn. So ideally, this class would only be used for you know, areas in the front end that were showing warnings, but no, we're actually using them to color the Jupyter logo. So this CSS class is being used in the icons for Jupyter, the Jupyter logo, the JupyterLab wordmark, the favicon, yeah, all things Jupyter. So what I suggest is basically getting rid of these generic classes that are not really being used appropriately, and instead replacing them with a with icon specific classes. So for example, for the Python icon, we would have JP icon Python, and that way we sort of separate the icons from each other and they're not all sharing from this generic class, so to speak. Yeah, and also for monochromatic icons, there would be a JP icon mono class. And this way, we're creating CSS classes that are much more accurate to their description instead of what we have currently, which is, you know, JP icon 3 is like, for example, there's JP icon 0 through 4. And right now, by default, in the default themes, they actually just represent various shades of gray. So a lot of icons in the UI have very slightly varying shades of gray, because I think it's not really made clear that it's not really clear which should be the standard. So I've sort of replaced most instances of the monochromatic icons with JP icon mono. Yeah, so just I've addressed a few comments from Frederick, and all the tests are passing. I reviewed all of the, made sure that there's no unintentional UI regressions. Yeah, so I'm totally welcoming review and thoughts on this.
I'll for sure make sure to take a look at it since I was part of the original discussion. I don't know if I'll have time this week, though. I'll probably get to it early next week.
Yeah, that's fine. I think it'll take some time for the discussion on this, since it's a pretty big change. It does affect the view that shows up when you're opening Jupyter. So this is a pretty big change. I expect there's going to be a bit more discussion.
Just to confirm without reading the diff, you're not removing any of the old CSS classes definition-wise. You're just replacing their uses.
Right. I think the idea is that this will be followed up eventually after this. Yeah, like there will be a follow-up to this that will hopefully rehaul. But this PR itself does not remove the styles for like all the generic CSS classes we're using.
Okay, good, because I know a lot of extensions use those classes and have been using them for so long they don't even think about it anymore.
Yeah. It does switch out. It does. I mean, the icons had to have the CSS classes changed, so I'm not really sure. Like the icons, so for example, if a theme developer was targeting icons, most of the monochromatic icons were using JP icon 3. So now that I've switched that class over to JP icon mono, I believe that any styles that are targeting that are using JP icon 3 as a selector would break. So I'm not really sure if, I'm not really sure if like what the approach is here to like whether we maintain backwards compatibility, because if I recall correctly, we are working on JupyterLab 4, right? Like that is in development. So if this is to be part of a new major release, like are we allowed, like is that fine to break backwards compatibility there?
Yeah, now that you bring that up, I would agree. We could break the backwards compatibility, but in this particular case, we would need to be very, 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 very thorough in documenting how to transition.
Yes.
Because a lot of people who do use this feature don't understand it. Like they literally like copied and pasted something from core a long time ago and just said, oh, it works good.
Yeah.
CSS is definitely not something most people bother to learn the intricacies of.
Well, the other problem with CSS is we have to concede that our CSS is a public API because it's just the nature of the language. So then that binds us to API contracts just like any other APIs we release, even though we don't get the sort of encapsulation you might want if you are truly designing it yourself, unless we switch to like a preprocessor language or something. But we made a choice not to use a preprocessor language in this way. And yeah, this is the time when we can change those APIs. It would probably be the bare minimum would be to put this in the extension migration guide that we've authored for each new version. But on top of that, if there were and our own extensions, of course, that like we're responsible for, PRs to those that update them. So at least we have some examples of here's how you update your extension CSS to the new thing. Like if we had a list of a couple extensions, like say the JupyterLab Git one, for example, right? If we could point to the PR that upgraded that thing's use of these APIs, I think that would be good to put in, say, either those extension migration guide or docs or in even a blog post or something. But
Mhm.
But now's the time, because if we don't do it now, we'll have to wait until JupyterLab 5 to do it.
Mhm. And I do think this is an important feature because it stops theme developers from accidentally overwriting important important CSS classes. Because right now, developing your own custom CSS for JupyterLab is almost like walking through a minefield, isn't it? Because some of these classes unintentionally change, for example, the Python logo, the Jupyter logo, icons that really don't want to be changed. So I do think this is important, and we should try to get this in for JupyterLab 4. And you're right, this is definitely the time to do so. Yeah, I'm totally welcoming like documentation suggestions. I did add some documentation for what JP icon mono does. I have not added any documentation yet for migrations. So like how to migrate from the old CSS system towards the new one. So I'm not sure if that's something we tackle in a future PR or if we bundle it in this one, because this one's already getting pretty large. Cool.
I'd say it's okay to do in a follow-up as long as we commit to making sure that follow-up gets in for 4.0.
Yeah, if this PR does get approved and merged, I will write a tracker issue, because there are a few there's a few other icons that need migration that I didn't touch because they would need a bit more work. But yeah. Are there any, so there's a few questions in the Zoom chat. It looks like JP icon 3 does not get removed. Is this correct? Not yet. I think the idea is that after a bit more discussion, we can decide whether we want to get rid of the old generic classes. But this PR that I posted and I'm discussing right now does not remove the styles. It just switches the icon SVG files to use the JP icon mono class. So even though like the class itself is not being removed like entirely from the code base, I've removed the the class is no longer, the icons no longer have that class. And are there any accessibility implications? None that I know of. Yeah. Hi, good morning, Isabella. We're just discussing this icon colors PR that I've worked on. Maybe you would like to take a look at this as well, because it does affect the a little bit the current design we have for JupyterLab.
Yeah, I am opening it now. Thank you. Yeah, sorry for the delay. The cat
There are
is here.
screenshots in there too, so you can just skim it.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to say anything because I think I missed the beginning of the discussion, but I do know some things that I'm looking for because, yeah, we'll see. Yeah, but thanks for following up on this.
Cool, thank you. And working on this stuff must be lots of fun, because we now have these visual regression tests that you have to update all the snapshots, didn't you?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for doing it. Okay, so Isabella is here, and you are up if you are ready to talk. If not, we can do a different thing first.
Yeah, no, I just have my usual announcements, but I wanted to make sure y'all know that things are always happening. One, the JupyterLab accessibility call will be 15 minutes after this one. It's one of those weeks. I do know some things that I hope we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk a little bit about automated testing updates and some related testing things, if that gets you excited, and or JupyterLab accessibility statement, understanding like how we can report our current status to people, since that's like commonly a requirement that people ask. So yeah, there's your teaser for the meeting after. The other thing is the Jupyter community call is coming up in 2 weeks. They usually do 2 week and 1 week announcements. So get your shares ready for that. It's this July. It's later though. I think it's actually kind of a European unfriendly time because I'm cycling through a few different times so we can see if there's something that's better to alternate between, since that was a request. So we're still in my experimental cycle. I believe it's 3 p.m. Pacific, so the middle of the night for some places, but we'll see if we get a different group of people. That's my goal. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. So Brian wanted to join this call, but he couldn't today. And I don't have links to share with you, but he is going to open Team Compass issues for discussion and vote around the organization of data models and the entities they model. So cell and cell model, notebook and notebook model. And what the place you import those things from, where that should be in the future, in the real-time collaboration future, where models are more complex, and there's a few ways we could go here. I think he'll be making a recommendation, or at least presenting a case for a way of doing this. And the background for this is to try to land what the actual architecture of RTC looks like. There are some sort of base level fundamental questions like, where should the notebook model be now that the notebook model is a collaborative thing? Should it be in a place that has the collaborative models for different things as well? Or should it reside with the notebook because it models the notebook? And I think those questions are the kind of thing where in the past we might have got into lots of bike shedding over, and now we have a JupyterLab council, and hopefully we can use the council to resolve questions that seem to have an endless discussion around them otherwise. And what I would say is, for all the people who are going to be asked to answer questions like this and don't have an opinion but are on the council, like, not having an opinion is fine. You can choose to abstain, which is still a vote, but at least it's not a vote with content, but at least it is a vote for quorum purposes. So be on the lookout for that. I think when he posts it, he'll probably tag the JupyterLab Council team on GitHub, and he'll probably send an email to the mailing list too. The reason I'm bringing it up, even though the issues don't exist, is because the rules are written to be a week for a vote, and I didn't want to have to wait until next week if Brian can author these issues today. So I'm just pre-announcing them, and hopefully you'll see that soon. Yeah, I think that's all I really have to say about that. Okay, is there anything anyone else wanted to bring up, because we're at the end of the agenda?
Can I ask a question about that last item?
Yeah, sure.
For those people that haven't been following along but would like to make an informed choice, will the issue comprehensively summarize the options and ramifications?
I think the issue is actually meant to be the opposite of a comprehensive summary. It's instead meant to be a foundational question of fairly simple organization of what kind of APIs do we want, so that we can create constraints around which to build RTC on top of, rather than, so in a way, this is to solve our question of how do we do this, but more it is to say, okay, as a team, we've decided these are the constraints around which we'll build APIs. And so, no, I don't think it'll be a big background context sort of thing. I think it'll more be, here are two models of ways we could organize these things. Of those, you know, Brian will probably express an opinion and say, this is the one this vote is advocating for. What do you guys think? Do you agree? I think, I haven't read what he's writing, but I imagine that's probably how he'll frame it. And the idea won't be to hash through the long discussions that have been going on and to distill it. It'll instead be to create nice constraints to make it easy to resolve issues instead of trying to adjudicate a harder question. This is meant to be an easier question.
the more principled guidance rather than resolving a specific technical question.
Yeah, that's right. Cool. If we don't have anyone else who wants to speak on the regular agenda, we do have 2 PRs that have been added to the PRs needing review. So it would be really helpful if anyone on this call wants to assign themselves as a reviewer. It's, I guess, a good time to announce that 24 hours from now, no, 24 hours and 18 minutes from now, we have the weekly triage call that Jason Weil hosts, and we look at issues that have come into JupyterLab and try to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. So if you can make that, that would be really helpful. And it's been really good. Jason's been running this for a while now, and I think this is the most responsive we've ever been to issues coming in. So it's great, but more people would be better.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the
Yeah.
shout out. Like I've done some of these where we've had just 1 or 2 people on the call, which makes it go very fast, but it's not very well informed. Our goal is to triage every issue, which is to say either accept it, close it, or ask for more information within a week of its filing. And as of right now, we've got 14 open issues in JupyterLab. And so even if you don't feel like you're tremendously qualified, this is a great way to learn more, because I'm certainly not knowledgeable about 100% of all these, but the big question is, like, should we accept an item as something potentially doable as an issue?
Yeah, and don't feel the pressure of, I don't know how to solve this person's issue. That's not what triage is. Triage is this issue one we need to try to solve? Is it one that's already been solved? Is it a duplicate? It's work that any one of us could do by just searching previous issues, or by trying to get the really low hanging fruit, like, hold on a second, they didn't even tell us what browser they were using, like those sorts of things. It's just to make sure that nothing that gets posted that's a good faith contribution, even if it's just a question, gets ignored. Like it's really good for, I think, giving community the confidence that the project is paying attention.
I just want to add a thanks to Jason and others that have participated. Often a comment will come in from the triage that will prompt me to look at an issue and make another comment or two. So having a comment from the triage, like, is a second note in the inbox. So it doubles or triples the visibility of that issue for others that aren't participating but can contribute asynchronously.
Yeah, I'm usually the one who adds comments on triaged issues, which means that sometimes I get positive comments back. More often I get criticism because I didn't understand an issue or I closed it prematurely. But to be honest, I would much rather say something that is wrong than say nothing at all, which is the normal track for a lot of open source projects, where you open an issue and it just seems to disappear into the void. And so you're less likely to file another issue.
Yeah, no, and another aspect of this that I think is worth pointing out is we do often get asked, what if I don't want to make code contributions, but I want to help you out? This is how you help out. Like, people are asking questions, you probably know the answer, come answer it. If you don't know the answer, but you know it's a legit question, mark it as a legit question, right? These are things that are easy to time box. You can set aside an hour, and that hour is like a meaningful contribution, and you get to walk away and not have to think about it. So it's yeah, it would be really it would have been really beneficial to have done this earlier, to be honest, but I'm glad it's happening now. Okay, I guess I will stop the recording. Brace yourselves.